Hello folks, Mike here, and I wanted to show you where I landed on my battle transition after a solid day of tweaking it. I got a lot of feedback from some friends of mine, suggestions of what direction to take it in after I got used to the material system, and there it was. I'll play it for you one more time. And there we go, a nice swooshy, blurry effect as the current camera view gets sucked into a terrible black hole of random battles. I'll give you a quick walkthrough of how this effect works, and I'm going to focus mainly on the material because the system that is running the transition right now is a bunch of proof-of-concept rigmarole that is set up inside of my level script that's mostly just telling it to run the effect and cut between different cameras. So the main component to this is a motion blur material function that you can find just by looking it up. There are a number of different blurs, including spiral blur, motion blur, and so on and so forth. But motion blur was the thing that I figured most resembled what I wanted to do. The common ground between all these JRPGs and their transitions is actually the blur in order to create an illusion of motion as you transition into a battle. Even though it swirls, it's really just rotating and blurring and zooming in, and that's most of what's going on. In fact, it wouldn't be very difficult for me to apply the rotator somewhere else and use that in order to control the blur in a way that's a little more spiral-like. But anyway, the motion blur takes in a handful of parameters. It takes in a vector for the direction that the blur is going in. It takes in UVs for the texture coordinates, the default value just being whatever the default texture coordinates are. It takes in a texture object parameter. I've got this hooked up to a canvas render target that I'm outputting basically a single still image to from a capture component 2D that is in my level. And then I have a distance value, which is the length that is getting blurred on a given frame. I feed in a strength parameter from outside and gradually bring this up. And then I have a constant of 100 that is applied to the steps variable. This generally controls the smoothness of the blur. The higher the number of steps you use, the more smooth and crisp it will look. If you lower the number of steps, it will tend to look a little bit choppy, is the word that I would use. It'll tend to look more like you've had an error dragging around a Windows frame and less like a motion blur. 100 seemed to be what suited this the most. For the UVs, I'm feeding in a number of functions that are designed to create the effect of a fisheye. So to start with, I am scaling up the UVs. Then I multiply it by 2 and subtract 1. And basically what that does is it offsets the coordinates of the UVs of this texture so that it is in the center that I'm doing all of my transformations instead of around the corner. If I didn't do this step, the fisheye would appear to happen from the upper left corner instead of the center of the image. I then use the vector length of the input texture coordinates, put that in through a power function, feed a power into it. If I use an exponent that approaches 0, that is less than 1, that will tend to create the fisheye effect. That will tend to stretch it inward. If I use a positive value, it will tend to inflate outward like a bubble in the middle of the picture. But Then I multiply it by a normalized version of the transformed texture coordinates, and then I transform it back to the way it was before by adding 1 and multiplying by 0.5 to move the coordinates back to the upper left corner. And then I can feed it into my motion blur and give it the effect of whoosh. It kind of blurs in such a way that it is stretching inward. I wonder if I could feed that in as the vector. Whatever. I can experiment with this a little more another time. Finally, there is an opacity setting that I am scaling downward from 1 after the strength value reaches a certain point. And that is what is responsible for crossfading from, excuse me, hiccups. That is responsible for what's crossfading from this effect to the new camera. It is all smoke and mirrors. It is actually just an image that is shown up on screen through the HUD. But anyway, that is a lowdown on how I got this effect. If you have any suggestions for what I could do to improve it, please feel free to tell me in the comments. But I wanted to give you an idea of how I accomplished it.